The blackboard, an object so ubiquitous in schools around the world that some historians have called it almost invisible, and that it slips into the background of our consciousness. The ubiquity and longevity of the blackboard speak to its ongoing usefulness, and though we don't often think about it as a writing technology, the introduction of the blackboard to education created a radical shift in teaching and learning that is maybe only now being equaled with the introduction of new media technologies to the classrooms. But there was a time before blackboards, a time when there was no great board at the front of the classroom where students could, together, focus their attention. In the late 18th century, children's education was not state-funded or universal, and for the most part it fell either to religious organizations or local communities to fund and equip their own schoolhouses. One-room schoolhouses were the norm, and children of a variety of ages and abilities were the students. The textbook was usually the Bible, though wealthier schools might also supply hornbooks or maybe a primer. Pen and paper, if available, were expensive, so most students worked on slate, which was fairly inexpensive and could be used over and over again. There was no shared curriculum, and teachers were tasked with teaching all students without any way to create a spontaneous visual demonstration that the whole class could view together. Students copied from books or from static displays on the walls. They could also work one-to-one with a teacher, though obviously teachers could only provide minimal individual attention. Slate was ill-suited to preserving writing over the long term, so learning relied heavily on rote and memorization. Language, which could not easily be retained in its visual form, had to be retained in memory, much as it had in pre-literate times. The early 19th century saw the beginning of a wave of school reforms that would sweep through Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Increasingly, schools and education came to be administered by the state. New laws were also enacted that protected children from compulsory apprenticeships. More and more children were candidates for education, but resources were still stretched thin. In England, in 1778, Joseph Lancaster introduced a revolutionary new form of schooling. His monitorial system consisted of one giant room with many rows of students and one headmaster. Each row of students was supervised by a student monitor, a pupil of higher level than those that he supervised. In this picture, we see two Italian officials attending a demonstration of the Lancaster method in the 1860s in Piedmont, Italy. As Ronald Raymond explains in his 1981 article on this subject, the Lancaster monitorial system was hailed as a milestone in public education. It was fairly inexpensive, and it could accommodate upwards of 350 students for each headmaster. It was seen as the solution for many different education problems, and for a short time it was evident in several European countries as well as in North America. It is in this period that the blackboard finds its way into classrooms. The first teacher to employ the technology is not known, and there are several competing theories. The first documented use of a blackboard, however, was by a mathematics teacher at West Point Military Academy in the United States in 1801. The blackboard was the perfect writing technology to meet the needs of the day. It allowed teachers an entirely new way to engage and teach increasingly large groups of students. As Stephen Krauss explains in his 2000 article, blackboards were an instant success because they enhanced the new Lancasterian and other approaches to teaching that assumed larger groups of students and more collaborative activity. Through the first half of the 19th century, blackboards became an imperative for schools. Though the Lancaster model itself was fairly short-lived, the appreciation of the collaborative teaching and learning opportunities afforded by the blackboard remained. The benefit of having a central point of focus in the classroom was evident, and schools and communities of all types went out of their way to ensure that they had one for their schoolroom. The first blackboards were made of stiff paper, wood, cloth, and plaster, but the use of a wall prepared and painted with a compounded black coating was the most common practice. High-quality slate and even porcelain blackboards would be created later, but in the early days, most schoolhouses prepared their own. Quite quickly, the blackboard became an essential part of the design of any schoolroom, and by 1844, England's Committee of Council on Education had classified the blackboard a standard classroom fixture and thus eligible for funding. Blackboards offered so many positive features and affordances, and that's what made them so attractive. I've listed the features below. They're easy to operate, relatively inexpensive, low maintenance, long-lasting, simple to use, flexible in application, dynamic and interactive, and extremely reliable as long as there's chalk available. The pedagogical affordances include the fact that they promote student engagement, they harness student attention, they allow for differentiation of materials, they create a shared point of focus, they facilitate cooperative and community learning, and they offer opportunities to showcase student work. Use of the Blackboard in the classroom didn't necessarily mean a radical pedagogical shift, though. In many basic subjects, teachers used blackboards in ways that were really just extensions of pre-Blackboard pedagogy. Reading, writing, and arithmetic pedagogies were among those that changed the least with the introduction of the Blackboard. Caitlin Wiley, a student of the role of the Blackboard in pedagogy, describes what standard lessons in those subjects might look like. For reading, teachers would write some text on the blackboard and students would read it together. Similarly, for writing, teachers would write a model on the blackboard and students would copy it. For arithmetic, the teacher would go through an equation on the blackboard and students would first observe carefully and then imitate the steps in subsequent equations performed on their own slates. For all of those subjects, observation and imitation were generally followed by correction, a new demonstration, and then more imitation. So as you can see, imitation and memorization were key to this approach, much as they had been for centuries. We can use the SAMR model developed by Dr. Ruben Puentedura to understand how the new technology was generally used in the classroom. For reading, writing, and arithmetic, substitution was achieved by using the blackboard as a model rather than static wall hangings or individual exemplars. Augmentation was achieved when teachers used the blackboard as a shared point of focus for community learning, and when they differentiated instruction based on the needs of their class. In these examples, the tasks were not significantly redesigned, but the functionality of existing pedagogy was significantly improved. This wasn't the case across the board, though, and for at least two distinct subjects, teachers used the blackboard in ways that genuinely transformed teaching and learning. The first of these subjects was the study of music. Music learning in schools had traditionally been highly focused on memorization and imitation. Teachers used sound to reach their students, and students would receive that sound and seek to imitate and memorize it. Juanita Karpf, who in her 2012 article explores the effect of the blackboard on music education, explained that the addition of the visual element completely transformed the way students interacted with music learning. This video demonstrates what learning music from a shared dynamic visual display is like. As you can imagine, the introduction of the visual element in music instruction allowed for much richer learning around intervals, pitch, and the length of tones. It also created valuable opportunities for interaction and student authorship at the blackboard. The other subject that used the blackboard to transform pedagogy was nature studies. In the 19th century, object lessons, wherein students would handle familiar objects with their teacher while learning about their properties, were quite common. These tended to happen more in home learning environments or small learning groups, though, because they were ill-suited to large group situations. As Caitlin Wiley explains, nature studies, which became popular in the early 20th century, was loosely patterned on this model, and students were encouraged to participate in hands-on study of local plants and animals. The blackboard allowed teachers to scale the object lesson model up for use in large group situations. Teachers would draw selected aspects of specimens being studied on the blackboard, while students observed that drawing process and also handled specimens at their desks. The performative element was key here. Students would discover elements of the diagram while it was being created, and the teacher was able to adapt the complexity of the diagram to suit her purpose and her students. So in this case, the blackboard actually enabled hands-on discovery learning by allowing teachers to guide and enhance student observation in an engaging and interactive way, and again at a level that was tailored to the students in the class. Returning to our SAMR model, it's evident that the blackboard was a technology that was used in transformative ways in the case of both music and nature instruction. Just as with any new technology in education, though, not everyone was happy with the way individual teachers were using the blackboard. In his 1910 article, History in the Secondary School, The Use of the Blackboard in the Teaching of History, Eldon Evans noted that many teachers used the blackboard incorrectly, despite receiving instruction on proper use as part of their teacher training, some of them because they didn't know how to go about it, and others because they were happy to join the ranks of backsliders. It may be, as David Tyack and Larry Cuban suggest in their 1995 article, that teachers adopted Blackboard use easily and without complaint when that adoption meant a simple extension of what they were already doing, but that to truly use the Blackboard as a transformative tool was a more disruptive change, and one that some teachers were more reluctant to engage with. In her article on disruptive writing technologies, Mary Godwin, writing in 2010, notes that in general, it's the pedagogy that drives the development of the technology, and not the technology that drives the pedagogy. In the case of blackboards, that was clearly true in the beginning. The technology rose out of an urgent need to be able to teach large groups of students. As that technology became more established in the classroom, though, and particularly in the case of certain subjects, the affordances offered by the blackboard did indeed drive the pedagogy. For that reason, we can rightly call the blackboard a disruptive technology and one that revolutionized schooling in the 19th and 20th centuries.